One decision changes everything. Remove a single line of stone and earth stretching 4,000 miles, and the entire history of human civilization pivots on a different axis. You're looking at northern China, 214 BCE. Emperor Qin Shi Huang stands at the edge of his newly unified empire, staring north toward the endless steppes where nomadic warriors gather like storm clouds on the horizon. In our timeline, he makes a choice that will consume the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers and define Chinese identity for millennia. But what if he never gave that order? What if the Great Wall of China, the most ambitious construction project in human history, was never built? The absence of this single structure doesn't just redraw borders. It rewrites languages. It reshapes religions. It redirects the flow of trade, technology, and power across 3 continents. The butterfly effect of this omission creates tsunamis through time, and today, we're diving into the alternate timeline that emerges when humanity's greatest barrier simply doesn't exist. To understand what vanishes, we must first understand what the wall defended against. For centuries before unification, the warring states of China lived in terror of the mounted warriors from the north, the Xiongnu Confederation. These weren't mere raiders. They were sophisticated military forces who could strike with devastating speed, vanish into the steppes, and return before defensive forces could mobilize. The northern kingdoms of Yan, Zhao, and Qin had already constructed primitive defensive walls of rammed earth and wood. But these were fragmented, vulnerable, easily bypassed. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he faced an impossible strategic dilemma. His empire stretched across fertile river valleys perfect for agriculture, but utterly exposed to cavalry assault. The solution in our timeline: connect those primitive walls into an unprecedented megastructure. 7 years of construction, 300,000 workers, a continuous barrier running from the Gobi Desert to the Yellow Sea. In the alternate timeline where this never happens, that strategic dilemma remains unsolved, and the consequences begin immediately. 214 BCE. Without the wall, the Qin dynasty attempts to defend its northern frontier through a network of garrison forts and mobile cavalry units. It's immediately insufficient. The Xiongnu, recognizing that no physical barrier restricts their movement, launch coordinated raids that penetrate hundreds of miles into Chinese territory. What follows is catastrophic. Unlike our timeline, where the wall channeled conflicts into predictable points that could be heavily defended, the alternate Qin must spread its forces impossibly thin. The northern provinces of Shanxi and Shanxi become perpetual war zones. Harvests are burned, villages abandoned. The tax revenue that should be flowing to the capital instead funds an endless, unwinnable guerrilla war. By 210 BCE, when Qin Shi Huang dies, his empire is already fracturing. The brutal legalist policies that held China together require absolute control. And control is impossible when your northern frontier is a sieve. The Qin dynasty, which lasted 15 years in our timeline, collapses in less than a decade here. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. What emerges from that collapse looks nothing like the Han dynasty we know. Without the stabilizing factor of a defensible northern border, China doesn't reunify. Instead, multiple successor kingdoms emerge, each adopting radically different strategies for survival. In the north, the Kingdom of Wei makes a controversial decision: mass integration. They begin recruiting Xiongnu warriors directly into their military, offering land grants in exchange for service. Within 3 generations, the distinction between Chinese and Xiongnu blurs entirely. A hybrid culture emerges, combining Chinese administrative sophistication with steppe military tactics. Further south, the Kingdom of Wu takes the opposite approach, abandoning the north entirely. They pour resources into naval development, expanding southward along the coast and across the sea toward what we know as Japan and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, smaller kingdoms in the interior become buffer states, paying tribute to both Chinese and nomadic powers, playing both sides. The concept of China as a unified civilization begins to fragment. Instead of one middle kingdom, 3 or 4 distinct Chinese civilizations develop independently, with different languages, different writing systems, different philosophies about governance and identity. The consequences ripple outward like shockwaves. In our timeline, the Han Dynasty established the Silk Road in the 2nd century BCE, but only because the Great Wall provided secure staging points for caravans heading west. Without the wall, and without a unified Han Dynasty, the famous Silk Road doesn't exist, at least not in the form we know. Trade still happens, of course, but it follows entirely different routes. The northern Chinese Xingnu hybrid kingdom establishes direct overland trade with Central Asian peoples. They speak the languages, understand the culture, move freely through territories that would have been barriers. Goods flow faster in some ways, but the lack of imperial Chinese oversight means smaller volumes, less standardization, fewer of the massive caravans that characterized our timeline. More significantly, the southern maritime kingdoms redirect trade toward the Pacific and Indian Oceans. While our timeline saw China eventually dominate naval trade in later dynasties, here it happens a millennium earlier. Chinese, or rather, Wu merchant vessels reach the Philippines, Indonesia, and potentially even Australia by the 1st century CE. The entire global trade network rotates 90 degrees. European merchants seeking Chinese silk must negotiate with maritime powers, not overland routes. The geopolitical implications are staggering. Buddhism's arrival in China becomes radically different. In our timeline, Buddhist missionaries traveled the Silk Road, arriving in China around the 1st century CE. The process was gradual, controlled, filtered through Chinese intellectual traditions. But without a unified China, and without the traditional Silk Road, Buddhism enters through multiple vectors simultaneously. The northern hybrid kingdom encounters Buddhism through Central Asian Xingnu who have already adopted the faith. It arrives mixed with shamanistic practices, emphasizing warrior monks and active engagement with the world. Meanwhile, maritime kingdoms encounter Buddhism from Indian Ocean traders, Theravada traditions that emphasize individual enlightenment. The result? Instead of one Chinese Buddhism, 3 or 4 distinct schools develop, each claiming authenticity. The religious landscape becomes extraordinarily diverse. Confucianism, without a unified imperial bureaucracy to sponsor it, becomes just one philosophy among many rather than the state ideology. Taoism flourishes in mountainous regions where neither Chinese nor nomadic powers can easily project force. By 500 CE, Chinese religion looks nothing like our timeline. It's a chaotic, vibrant marketplace of competing ideas, with no single tradition dominant. Fast forward to the 13th century CE. Genghis Khan rises, but here's the crucial difference. There is no Great Wall to overcome. In our timeline, the Mongols eventually breached the wall, but it took decades and forced them to adapt, to develop siege tactics, to transform from pure cavalry into a combined arms force. That transformation made them capable of conquering not just China, but the entire known world, without the wall as a forcing function. The Mongol expansion looks entirely different. The northern hybrid kingdoms, already culturally similar to steppe peoples, negotiate rather than fight. Many join the Mongol Confederation voluntarily. The southern maritime kingdoms, however, prove nearly impossible to conquer. The Mongols have no naval tradition, and these kingdoms have been maritime powers for over 1,000 years. The Mongol Empire still forms, but it's lopsided, focused entirely on westward expansion toward Europe and the Middle East. Without controlling the Chinese agricultural heartland and its administrative expertise, the Mongol Empire never develops the bureaucratic sophistication that, in our timeline, allowed it to rule effectively. It remains a military confederation that fragments within a generation of Genghis Khan's death. The Pax Mongolica that enabled East-West exchange never happens, and without that, the Renaissance in Europe unfolds very differently. In our timeline, the Ming Dynasty expelled the Mongols and rebuilt the Great Wall even more impressively than before, creating the stone barrier we know today. But in this alternate timeline, there is no Ming unification. Instead, the collapse of Mongol influence leaves behind a patchwork of regional powers, none strong enough to dominate the others. The southern maritime kingdoms continue their Pacific expansion, establishing colonies that will eventually contest European colonialism in the age of exploration. When Portuguese ships arrive in the 16th century, they don't find a unified Ming Empire resisting foreign trade. They find competing kingdoms eager for European weapons and technology, willing to form alliances against their rivals. The northern kingdoms, still hybrid Chinese-Turkic cultures, maintain strong trade ties with the Ottoman Empire and Central Asian Khanates. By 1600 CE, what we call China is actually 4 or 5 distinct civilizations, each with their own language dialects so divergent they're mutually unintelligible, their own writing systems modified from the original characters, their own political systems ranging from merchant republics in the south to nomadic confederations in the north. The very concept of a unified Chinese identity doesn't exist. Now we arrive at the present day, or rather, what the present day looks like in this timeline, where our world has the People's Republic of China, a unified state of 1.4 billion people and the world's second largest economy. This alternate world has something entirely different. The southern maritime nations evolved into modern democratic federations, culturally closer to Southeast Asian countries than to northern China. They're technological powerhouses, leading in naval engineering and Pacific trade networks. The northern regions, after centuries of cultural mixing, resemble Central Asian republics more than East Asian nations. Multilingual, multi-ethnic, with economies based on resource extraction and overland trade. The interior regions remain agricultural, less developed, caught between competing spheres of influence. There's no single Chinese language-dominating global business. No Belt and Road Initiative. No unified Asian counterweight to Western power. The global balance of power is fundamentally different. English remains dominant in technology and trade, but alongside Persian, Vietnamese, and hybrid northern dialects. The 21st century world is more multipolar, more fragmented, with no single Asian superpower to contest American hegemony. The absence of one structure, one wall, reshapes everything. So what have we lost? Or gained? The Great Wall of China was never just a military fortification. It was a statement of identity, a line drawn in stone declaring, "This is us, that is them." Without it, the concept of a unified Chinese civilization never solidifies. We lose the continuity of a culture that spans millennia. We lose the administrative innovations that unified empire required. We lose the artistic traditions that developed within protected borders. But we gain something else: diversity. Multiple Chinese civilizations developing independently, each innovating in different directions. Maritime powers expanding across the Pacific centuries earlier. Hybrid cultures bridging East and Central Asia, preventing some conflicts while creating others. The question isn't whether this alternate world is better or worse. It's whether identity itself, national, cultural, civilizational, requires boundaries. The Great Wall didn't just keep invaders out. It kept an idea in, the idea of China itself. And when you remove that structure, that idea fragments into 1,000 pieces, each one reflecting a different possible future. The stones of the wall are gone in this timeline, but so is everything they contained. Was it worth building? In our world, 1.4 billion people share a common identity because of it. In this alternate world, they don't. You decide which timeline you'd rather inhabit.